Before we get started, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video. That way, you'll always stay connected to our stories and never miss the next adventure. The luminous accord hung in the void like a monument to optimistic bureaucracy, all gleaming hull plating and biodomes that promised a bright, unified future for the galaxy's youth. Somewhere in the bowels of its education wing, that promise was about to get significantly more complicated. Vaughn McAllister stood at the front of classroom 3G, watching his students file in with the kind of resigned amusement usually reserved for people who'd chosen chaos as a career path. And really, that's exactly what teaching interspecies communication amounted to, wasn't it? Controlled chaos with a syllabus. The classroom itself was a feat of engineering that probably gave the facility designers stress headaches. Multi-gravity zones overlapped in carefully calibrated sections, atmospheric processors hummed at different frequencies to accommodate everything from methane breathers to the aquatic types who needed their mobile water spheres, and the temperature varied by as much as 30 degrees from one corner to another. It was like someone had taken 6 different planets and shoved them into a blender, set to coexist peacefully. "Morning, everyone," Vaughn called out, his voice carrying that particular brand of forced cheerfulness that all teachers perfect by their 3rd week. "Let's talk about conflict de-escalation through body language today, shall we?" A chorus of responses came back in various pitches, tones, and frequencies that the universal translators gamely attempted to render as "Good morning, Instructor McAllister." Wimbley, the Melville student who looked like someone had taken a rabbit, stretched it to 4 feet tall, given it opposable thumbs, and then made it perpetually anxious, twitched his nose nervously as he settled into his seat. The poor kid had been jumpy since day 1, which was probably what happened when you evolved on a planet where literally everything wanted to eat your ancestors. Ulun, one of the Fenshai aquatics, drifted in their mobile sphere toward the designated water gravity zone, tentacles moving in that graceful way that always made Vaughn think of synchronized swimming. They, at least, seemed relatively calm. Aquatic species tended to have a different relationship with danger, perhaps because their homeworld's threats came from all directions simultaneously, and they'd learned to just accept the existential dread as background noise. Then there was Kimura. The Shirel student prowled, and really, there was no other word for it, into the classroom like she owned not just the space, but the entire conceptual framework of education itself. She was sleek in the way that predators are sleek, all coiled muscle and barely contained violence wrapped in midnight black fur that seemed to absorb light. Her species looked like someone had taken a panther, added a few too many teeth, extended the claws, and then given the whole package a cruel intelligence that enjoyed psychological warfare as much as physical dominance. Chimura's eyes, golden, slit-pupiled, and currently radiating boredom, swept the classroom before settling on Vaughn with the kind of dismissive assessment that said, "Soft, fangless, probably tastes bland." Vaughn had seen that look before. Granted, it had usually been on the faces of dingoes and the occasional cassowary back home in the Australian outback, but contempt was a universal language that predated actual language by a few million years. "Chimora," Vaughn acknowledged with a nod. "Glad you could join us. Please take your seat." The Shirel cub, and at 6 months into her adult growth cycle, she was still technically a juvenile, though she was already larger than Vaughn, considered the request with the kind of deliberation that suggested compliance was optional, and she was doing him a favor by even contemplating it. Finally, with a fluid motion that showcased exactly how fast she could move if she wanted to, Chimora settled into her designated spot in the high-gravity section. Her tail, tipped with what looked uncomfortably like a biological mace, swished once in irritation. "Right," Vaughn continued, pulling up a holographic display that showed various species in different postures. Conflict de-escalation. The fundamental principle here is understanding that what reads as aggressive in one species might be completely neutral in another. For instance, direct eye contact is a challenge, Chimora interrupted, her voice coming out in a purr that the translator rendered with an edge of amusement. Everyone knows this. Why are we wasting time on basics? Wimbley's ears flattened against his skull. Ulun's tentacles pulled slightly tighter into their sphere. The other students, a mix of herbivores, omnivores, and one insectoid, whose species name Vaughn still couldn't pronounce without sounding like he was choking, shifted uncomfortably. Vaughn, for his part, kept his expression neutral. Because everyone knows this is how you end up in an interspecies incident that requires diplomatic intervention. Direct eye contact is a challenge in Shirel culture, yes. But in human culture, it's a sign of honesty and engagement. In Mel V culture, he nodded toward Wimbley, it's actually a sign of submission and trust, because prey species only maintain eye contact when they're certain the other party won't attack. Chimora's tail swished again, harder this time. Prey species, she repeated, and there was something in the way she said it that made the temperature in the room feel like it had dropped a few degrees. Yes, that's what they are. That's what you are. Playing at being teachers and students doesn't change nature. And there it was. The underlying tension that had been building since Chimora had been enrolled in the Galactic Educational Consortium's flagship academy. The Shirel came from a death world, and not the fun kind of death world where things just tried to poison you or freeze you to death, but the genuinely nightmarish kind where apex predators competed for dominance in an ecosystem that had more carnivores than herbivores, and where hunting wasn't just a survival strategy but a cultural identity. Vaughn had read the files. The Shirel were being integrated into galactic society slowly, carefully, with all the diplomatic delicacy of diffusing a bomb that had teeth and could hold grudges. They were brilliant, efficient, and absolutely terrifying to most other species. They were also crucial to any long-term stability in their sector of space, which meant people like Vaughn got volunteered to figure out how to make them play nice with civilizations that hadn't spent the last 10,000 years perfecting the art of tactical dismemberment. Nature, Vaughn repeated, and he let a small smile play at the corner of his mouth. Right, let's talk about nature then. He switched off the holographic display and faced his students directly. Nature says that Shirel are apex predators. Nature also says that humans are persistence hunters who learn to coordinate in packs, track prey for days, and outlast faster, stronger animals through sheer stubbornness. Nature says that Mel V are prey species who compensate with incredible hearing and reaction times. Nature says a lot of things, but here's the thing about nature. Chimora stood up. It wasn't a casual movement. It was the kind of motion that screamed threat display in every language spoken across the galaxy. She rose to her full height, which put her a solid foot taller than Vaughn, even accounting for her digitigrade stance, and her lips pulled back to reveal teeth that evolution had spent a very long time sharpening into nightmare fuel. The sound that came from her throat didn't need a translator. It was a growl, low and resonant, the kind of sound that made small mammals instinctively search for holes to hide in. It carried with it the weight of genetic memory, of prey species ancestors learning too late what that sound meant. Wimbley made a strangled noise and actually dove under his desk. Ulun's sphere wobbled as they pulled all their tentacles into a defensive ball. The insectoid students' antennae flattened completely against their carapace. The universal translator, in its infinite wisdom, rendered Chimora's growl as You will not lecture me about nature, soft thing. I am nature. You are meat that learned to talk. The classroom had gone absolutely silent, except for the ambient hum of the environmental systems. This was it. The moment that Vaughn's superiors had warned him about, the reason he'd had to sign approximately 15 different liability waivers before accepting this position. This was where a human instructor either established authority or became a cautionary tale told to future candidates. Vaughn looked at Chimora, at her bared teeth and her aggressive posture and her absolute certainty that she was the apex predator in this room and that he was, at best, an annoyance to be tolerated. And then Vaughn. McAllister did something that confused every single being in that classroom. He smirked. Not a nervous smile, not a placating gesture. A genuine, amused smirk that said he'd just heard something that was simultaneously threatening and kind of adorable, like a kitten hissing at a thunderstorm. Chimora's growl faltered. Just for a second, but it was there. Confusion flickered across her predatory features because Prey didn't smirk. Prey ran, or froze, or submitted. Prey did not look at an apex predator displaying active aggression and respond with what appeared to be amusement. "Is that right?" Vaughn said, his voice calm, conversational, like they were discussing the weather rather than standing at the precipice of violence. "I'm meat that learned to talk. That's a new one. Points for creativity." He took a step forward. Every student in the classroom inhaled sharply. You didn't move toward an aggressive Shirelle. You backed away slowly, avoided eye contact, made yourself small and non-threatening. Moving forward was suicidal. Vaughn took another step. Chimora's ears flattened slightly, her tail going still. The growl had stopped entirely now, replaced by a look of genuine confusion that warred with her aggressive instincts. "Here's the thing about nature, Chimora," Vaughn continued, taking a third step that put him well within striking distance. "You're absolutely right that you're an apex predator. Your species spent millennia earning that title, and I respect the hell out of that. But you know what humans did? We took wolves, your evolutionary cousins, basically, and we convinced them to join our pack. Not through force, not by being bigger or meaner. We did it by being smarter, more patient, and by understanding what it meant to be part of something larger than individual dominance." He was close now, close enough that he could see the individual whiskers on her snout, close enough that if she wanted to strike, he wouldn't be able to react in time. The smirk never left his face. "You want to know what I am?" Vaughn asked quietly. "I'm the species that learned to speak apex predator fluently enough to make them forget we were prey. So go ahead, Chimora. Bare your teeth. Show me how nature works." The classroom held its breath. Chimora stared at the human standing before her, this soft, fangless creature who should be cowering, but instead looked like he was evaluating her the same way she'd been evaluating him. Her instincts were screaming contradictions at her. Prey didn't act like this, didn't move like this, didn't meet aggression with that infuriating calm confidence. And then Vaughn did something that would later be analyzed in xenobiology departments across the galaxy. He reached out, slowly and deliberately, and tapped Chimora once on the snout with 2 fingers. Not hard enough to hurt, not soft enough to be mistaken for affection. A correction. The kind of firm, no-nonsense tap that said, "No, bad. We don't do that here." The kind of tap a mother predator might give an overconfident cub who'd forgotten their manners. For 3 heartbeats, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Chimora's eyes went wide, her pupils dilating in shock, every muscle in her body locked up, as her brain tried to process what had just happened, tried to reconcile the fact that prey had just corrected her, disciplined her, asserted authority over her. That wasn't possible. That wasn't how the universe worked. Prey ran. Predators dominated. Those were the rules written into the fabric of evolutionary biology. Except this prey hadn't run. This prey had walked toward her, met her aggression with amusement, and then, impossibly, incomprehensibly, had treated her like a misbehaving child. Something deep in Chimora's hindbrain, some ancient instinct that predated language or civilization, activated. It was the same instinct that made juvenile predators recognize pack hierarchy, that made them understand when they'd overstepped and needed to submit to a superior authority figure. Slowly, as if her body was moving without conscious permission, Chimora rolled onto her back. The movement was fluid, graceful, despite its submission. She exposed her belly, her throat, the most vulnerable parts of her anatomy, in the ultimate gesture of surrender in Shirel culture. Her tail curled protectively against her body. Her ears remained flat, and her eyes, still wide with shock, stared up at Vaughn with an expression that suggested she was just as surprised by her own actions as everyone else. Wimberly emerged from under his desk slowly, his mouth hanging open in disbelief. Ulun's tentacles unfurled from their defensive ball, spreading out against the inner surface of their sphere as they processed what they'd just witnessed. The insectoid student's translator emitted a series of clicking sounds that roughly translated to, "What the actual hell just happened?" Vaughn looked down at the apex predator currently displaying submission at his feet and allowed his smirk to widen just slightly. "Good," he said simply. "Now we can continue the lesson." The silence in classroom 3G stretched like taffy, sticky and uncomfortable, and threatening to snap at any moment. Somewhere in the ventilation system, a filter hummed. It was, quite possibly, the loudest sound in the known universe right then. Vaughn extended a hand down toward Chimora, who was still on her back, still processing the fact that her own instincts had betrayed her more thoroughly than any enemy ever could. Her golden eyes tracked the movement with the kind of hyper-focus that suggested she was recalculating every assumption she'd ever made about prey species, dominance hierarchies, and the fundamental nature of reality itself. "Come on," Vaughn said, his tone remarkably casual considering he was offering to help up a creature that could disembowel him in about half a second. "Let's not make this weird." Chimora stared at the offered hand like it might be a trap. Which, fair enough, because from her perspective, the last 60 seconds had been nothing but traps, psychological ones that had somehow proven more effective than anything physical could have been. After a moment that felt like it lasted several geological epochs, she reached up and took his hand. Her claws, retracted but still visible, were careful not to puncture his skin as Vaughn pulled her to her feet. The fact that she was being careful at all was probably significant, though nobody was quite ready to unpack that particular revelation yet. Once upright, Chimora stepped back quickly, putting distance between herself and the human. Her tail lashed once, agitated, confused. She looked like she wanted to say something, probably something scathing and aggressive that would restore her sense of dignity, but the words weren't coming. How did you threaten someone who'd just made you roll over like an obedient house pet? "Right," Vaughn said, clapping his hands together once and turning back to address the class. His movement was deliberately casual, deliberately non-threatening, giving Chimora space to recover without making it obvious that's what he was doing. "So, body language. As we've just demonstrated, it's complicated. Wimbley raised a shaking hand, his voice coming out about 3 octaves higher than usual. Instructor McAllister, I have questions. So many questions. Starting with how are you still alive, and ending with what, in the name of all the stars, just happened. Vaughn's lips twitched. Would you believe me if I said I grew up doing this? Nos, Ulun said flatly, their translator rendering their bubbling vocalization with admirable directness. No sentient being would believe that. Humans aren't suicidal as a species, are they? Depends on who you ask, Vaughn replied, and there was something in his tone that suggested this was a joke he'd made before, probably to the horror of every xenobiologist who'd ever studied Earth. But to answer your question properly, let me tell you about my childhood, which, now that I think about it, probably explains why the consortium hired me in the first place. He pulled up a holographic image, Earth, rotating slowly in all its blue-green glory. I grew up in a place called the Australian Outback. For those of you unfamiliar with Earth's geography, Australia is what happens when a continent decides that evolution's goal is to create as many things that can kill you as possible, and then concentrate them all in one location for efficiency. The hologram is zoomed in, showing vast stretches of red desert punctuated by scrubland. Dingoes, snakes, spiders the size of your hand, cassowaries, which are basically living dinosaurs with anger management issues, saltwater crocodiles, box jellyfish, and if you're really unlucky, drop bears. Drop bears aren't real, Chimora said suddenly, her voice still somewhat shaky, but regaining its edge. I researched Earth predators. That's human misinformation. Vaughn smiled. The fact that you researched Earth predators tells me you were taking this more seriously than you let on. But you're right, drop bears are a myth. Everything else I mentioned, though, completely real, and I spent my formative years working wildlife rehabilitation with my family. Another holographic image appeared, a younger Vaughn, maybe 16, crouched next to what looked like an extremely large, extremely angry canine. This is a dingo we were rehabilitating after it got hit by a transport. Beautiful animal. Also wanted to eat my face off for the first 3 weeks. Wimbley made a distressed sound. Why would you do that? Why would anyone do that? Because someone had to, Vaughn said simply. Here's what I learned. Predators aren't mindless killing machines. They're intelligent, social, and they understand hierarchy. They test boundaries constantly because that's how they figure out where they stand in the pack order. Aggression isn't always about violence. Sometimes it's communication. He gestured toward Chimora, who was watching him with an intensity that would have been unnerving if Vaughn wasn't already used to it. When Chimora stood up and bared her teeth, she wasn't actually trying to hurt me. She was testing, seeing if I'd run, if I'd submit, if I'd call for backup. Classic dominance display. I was threatening you, Chimora said, and there was a note of indignation in her voice that suggested she didn't appreciate having her aggressive intentions downplayed. You were, Vaughn agreed, but you were also waiting to see what I'd do. If I'd backed down, you would have accepted that as confirmation of your place in the hierarchy. You'd have been more difficult to teach from that point forward, but you wouldn't have attacked. Not really, because attacking would have gotten you expelled, and you're smart enough to know that. Chimora's tail swished again, but slower this time. Thoughtful. What you didn't expect, Vaughn continued, was for me to move forward instead of back. In predator psychology, that's significant. Prey retreats. Competitors advance. By moving toward you instead of away, I was signaling that I wasn't prey. I was another predator in your space. But you're not a predator, the insectoid student pointed out. their translator rendering their clicking with admirable logic. Humans are omnivores with minimal natural weapons. You shouldn't register as a threat to a Shirel. Physically, you're right. But here's the thing about humans. We didn't become the dominant species on our planet by being the biggest or the strongest. We did it by being the smartest and the most adaptable. We learned to read body language from dozens of different species because we had to. We hunted some, were hunted by others, and domesticated the rest. Vaughn pulled up another image. A human child sitting with a massive dog, both looking completely comfortable with each other. We took wolves, one of Earth's apex predators, and turned them into companions. Not by dominating them through force, but by understanding pack dynamics well enough to insert ourselves into their social structure. We became pack leaders to animals that could kill us, and we did it through psychology, not physical dominance. He looked at Chimora directly. When I tapped your snout, I wasn't hitting you. I was correcting you. The same way a mother predator corrects a cub who's overstepped. Your instincts recognized that pattern even if your conscious mind didn't, and you responded accordingly. Chimora's ears flattened slightly, and for a moment she looked very young despite her size. I shouldn't have. My species doesn't submit to prey species, Vaughn finished. I know, but that's the lesson, Chimora. I'm not prey. None of us are. Not really. We're all just intelligent beings trying to figure out how to coexist. And that means understanding that dominance isn't always about who has the biggest teeth. Sometimes it's about who understands the psychology behind the teeth. The classroom was quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. Thoughtful. Processing. Chimora sat down slowly, her posture less aggressive than it had been at the start of class. She looked at Vaughn with an expression that might have been respect, might have been resentment, and was probably a complicated mixture of both. You're dangerous, she said finally. Vaughn's smirk returned. Only to people who think teeth are the only thing that matters. The rest of the class proceeded with a notable shift in atmosphere, like someone had turned down the tension dial from impending violence to merely uncomfortable awareness that violence was theoretically possible but currently on hold. Chimora participated in the exercises, though with a subdued quality that suggested she was still processing her existential crisis. Wimbley stopped hiding under furniture. Ulun actually seemed engaged. All in all, Vaughn counted it as a teaching victory. When the session ended and students began filing out, Chimora lingered. She stood by her desk, tail moving in slow, agitated sweeps, clearly wanting to say something, but equally clearly not sure how to say it without undermining whatever remained of her dignity. Vaughn pretended to organize his teaching materials, giving her time. Predators appreciated space to approach on their own terms. It was one of those universal constants, right up there with entropy, and the fact that administrative paperwork expanded to fill all available time. Finally, Chimora spoke. My parent is going to hear about this. I'd be disappointed if they didn't, Vaughn replied, not looking up from the holographic display he was supposedly reviewing. Part of the learning process is talking through challenging experiences with family. You don't understand. There was something in her voice now, not quite fear, but adjacent to it. Cheven doesn't believe in this integration. She thinks the consortium is trying to weaken our species, make us soft. When she finds out I submitted to a human... Vaughn did look up then, meeting Chimora's eyes. The young Shirel didn't flinch away this time, which was progress. What do you think? Are you weaker now than you were this morning? Chimora's claws extended slightly, an unconscious gesture. I don't know. I feel confused. angry, but also, she trailed off, searching for words. Also, like maybe you learned something? Vaughn offered. I hate that, Chimora said with feeling. I hate that learning things makes me feel uncertain. I'm supposed to be certain. Apex predators don't doubt. Apex predators who don't doubt get eaten by the ones who learn to adapt, Vaughn countered. Ask Earth's saber-toothed cats how certainty worked out for them. Spoiler alert, they're extinct, and regular cats domesticated humans instead of the other way around. Adaptability beats certainty every time in the long game. Chimora's tail stopped moving. She stared at Vaughn with that intense predator focus again, but this time it felt less like she was evaluating him as prey, and more like she was trying to figure out a particularly complicated puzzle. You're very strange for prey. You're very thoughtful for a predator, Vaughn replied. Maybe we're both more complicated than the categories suggest. After another moment of consideration, Chimora nodded once, a gesture she'd picked up from observing humans, since Shirelle typically indicated agreement with ear movements, and left the classroom. Her gait was smoother now, less aggressive prowling and more confident walking. Small victory, but Vaughn would take it. He was packing up his actual materials when the classroom's communication panel chimed. The face that appeared on the screen was insectoid, compound eyes glittering with what Vaughn had learned to recognize as Administrator Fulmet's version of barely suppressed exasperation. Instructor McAllister, she said, her translator rendering her clicking speech with the kind of bureaucratic weariness that transcended species boundaries. I've received a formal complaint. Already? Vaughn checked his chronometer. Class ended 5 minutes ago. That's impressively fast for bureaucratic outrage. The complaint isn't from a student. It's from the Shirelle diplomatic liaison. Apparently, there was an incident. Vaughn sighed. There was an educational moment. I'm guessing the incident interpretation is coming from Chimora's parent? Chauvin, yes. Fulmetet's antennae twitched in what might have been the insectoid equivalent of a headache. She's demanding to speak with you, also demanding that her offspring be withdrawn from the program, also making what I believe are threats, though the translator is rendering them as culturally specific expressions of displeasure, which is diplomats for threats. When does she want to meet? She's already on station. She'll be at your classroom in approximately 10 minutes. Fulmet paused. Security is on standby. Please try not to die. The paperwork for replacing you would be substantial. Your concern is touching, Vaughn said dryly. I'm serious, instructor. Chauvin is not a juvenile. She's a fully mature Shirelle hunter with 6 confirmed solo kills of megafauna on her homeworld and a temperament that makes Chimora look cuddly by comparison. The diplomatic corps has been very careful about how they interact with her. Noted. I'll try to avoid becoming a diplomatic incident. Too late for that, Fulmet muttered, and disconnected. Vaughn sat down at his desk and pulled up Chauvin's file, which he'd reviewed when Chimora first enrolled, but hadn't looked at in depth. The image that loaded made him understand why the consortium was nervous. If Chimora was sleek and dangerous, Chauvin was a walking nightmare that evolution had spent extra time perfecting. She was larger, scarred, and had the kind of eyes that suggested she'd seen violence up close and personal, and had walked away the victor every single time. The biographical data was equally intimidating. Chauvin had risen to prominence in Shirelle society not through political maneuvering, but through the traditional method, being so effective at hunting that other Shirelle acknowledged her superiority. She'd been against integration from the start, viewing the consortium's educational programs as attempts to dilute Shirelle culture and turn her species into something domesticated and weak. She'd only allowed Chimora to attend the academy because Shirel politics were complicated, and refusing consortium offers had its own diplomatic consequences. But she'd made it clear she was looking for any excuse to withdraw her offspring and validate her position that predator species didn't belong in mixed species environments. And Vaughn had just handed her that excuse on a silver platter by making her daughter submit. "Well," he said to the empty classroom, "this should be interesting." Interesting turned out to be an understatement. When Chauvin arrived, she didn't knock or announce herself or follow any of the polite protocols that had been carefully negotiated between the consortium and the Shirel diplomatic corps. She simply walked through the door, which, to be fair, opened automatically, but her entrance still had the quality of a predator arriving at a kill site and expecting everything else to scatter. She was even more imposing in person than her file suggested. The scars that marked her dark fur weren't the random marks of accidents, but the deliberate patterns of ritual combat, each one telling a story of dominance established and maintained. Her eyes found Vaughn immediately and locked on with the kind of focus that made being stared at by Chimora feel like a gentle social interaction. "You," she said, and even with the translator smoothing out her vocalizations, the word carried weight. "You are the prey thing that humiliated my offspring." Vaughn stood slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. No sudden gestures around adult Shirel unless you wanted to trigger predator drive reflexes that had been honed across millennia. "I'm Instructor Vaughn McAllister. Your daughter is a talented student who's learning important skills about interspecies communication. She submitted to you." Chauvin moved into the classroom properly now, and even though the space was designed to accommodate multiple species, she somehow made it feel smaller just by existing in it. "A Shirel, submitted, to a human. Explain why I shouldn't remove her from this place immediately and file a formal protest with the consortium for allowing such degradation." "Because she learned something valuable," Vaughn offered, keeping his tone conversational despite the fact that his hindbrain was screaming at him to find an exit. Adult Shirel didn't just look dangerous, they radiated threat the way stars radiated light, constant and inescapable. Chauvin's lips pulled back, revealing teeth that made Chimora's look like baby fangs by comparison. "She learned to be weak, to bow to creatures that should fear her. This is what your consortium wants, yes? To take predator species and break them, make them docile." "No," Vaughn said, and there was an edge to his voice now. "She learned that strength isn't just about physical dominance. She learned that intelligent beings need to understand psychology, not just biology. She learned that the galaxy is full of species with different capabilities, and knowing how to navigate those differences is more valuable than knowing how to intimidate prey." "Pretty words from meat," Chauvin growled, taking another step forward. She was close enough now that Vaughn could see the individual muscles moving under her fur, could smell something sharp and predatory that his ancestors would have recognized as danger. "But words mean nothing. Actions mean everything. You made her submit. That is an insult to her lineage, to her species, to me." Security should have been here by now, Vaughn thought distantly. But then maybe they were hanging back, waiting to see if the human instructor could talk his way out of this before they escalated things into an interstellar incident. No pressure or anything. "You're right," Vaughn said, and watched Chauvin's ears twitch in surprise. "Actions do mean everything. So let's talk about actions." Chimora challenged me with a dominance display. I responded by asserting authority. She submitted because her instincts recognized that I understood pack hierarchy better than she expected. That's not weakness on her part. That's intelligence. She recognized a teaching moment and adapted. Teaching moment, Chauvin repeated, her voice dripping with contempt. You speak as if dominance is something to be taught, not taken, as if submission is acceptable. These are prey philosophies. These are survivor philosophies, Vaughn countered. Your species survived by being apex. Predators, yes. My species survived by being adaptable enough to make apex predators work with us instead of against us. Both strategies are valid. Both require intelligence and skill. Chauvin moved fast, not attacking, but closing distance in a blur of motion that put her directly in front of Vaughn, looming over him with all the menace her species had perfected. You think you understand predators because you played with domesticated animals on your soft world. You understand nothing. You are prey pretending to be dangerous. It's pathetic. And that's when Vaughn made a decision that would later be described by Administrator Fulmet as either brilliant or catastrophically stupid, with the assessment depending entirely on whether he survived the next 60 seconds. He looked up at Chauvin, met her eyes, and said calmly, Your daughter challenged me. She submitted, not because I broke her, because I gave her something she needed. Boundaries, respect, someone who wasn't afraid of her. Can you honestly tell me you've been giving her those things? Or have you been so busy being apex that you forgot cubs need teachers, not just examples of dominance? The silence that followed could have been cut with a knife, or more accurately, with Chauvin's claws, which were currently fully extended and looked very interested in introducing Vaughn's internal organs to the outside world. This was either going to work, or it was going to be a very short and violent learning experience about the limitations of interspecies psychology. The classroom had barely settled back into normalcy when the emergency alert chimed, 3 sharp tones that made every student freeze. Vaughn's teaching pad flashed with a priority message from Administrator Fulmet, Chauvin incoming. Stall if possible. Security en route. The door opened before he could respond. Chauvin entered like a storm given physical form. Where Kimura was sleek and dangerous, her parent was a walking apocalypse, wrapped in scarred fur and barely contained violence. She was massive, easily twice her daughter's size, with ritual combat marks that told stories of dominance established through blood and brutality. Her eyes found Vaughn immediately. You, she growled, the translator rendering her voice with contempt that needed no interpretation. The prey thing that made my offspring submit. Around the classroom, students pressed themselves against walls. Wimbley actually whimpered. Even Ulun's sphere retreated toward the ceiling, tentacles pulled tight in instinctive terror. Instructor McAllister, Vaughn corrected calmly, though his pulse hammered in his throat. And your daughter learned an important lesson today. She learned weakness. Chauvin prowled closer, each step deliberate, measured. The scars on her flanks rippled with muscle movement, evidence of battles survived, dominance earned. She learned to bow to creatures that should cower before her. You have poisoned her with prey philosophy. Vaughn didn't retreat, didn't advance either. No need to be stupid about this. I taught her that intelligence matters more than teeth. Intelligence! Chauvin spat the word like a curse. Her tail lashed once, twice, the biological mace at its tip leaving a dent in the wall panel. Pretty philosophy for soft species, but the universe runs on blood and dominance, always has, always will. Does it? Vaughn gestured around the classroom. Because last I checked, the consortium has maintained peace across 200 species for 3 generations. Not through blood, through understanding. Your species joined because even apex predators need allies against bigger threats. Chauvin's growl deepened, resonating in frequencies that made everyone's bones ache. We joined because isolation has costs, not because we believe prey and predator can truly coexist. My daughter will not be made weak by your lessons in false harmony. False harmony? Vaughn's voice sharpened. Your daughter challenged me with every expectation that I'd either cower or call for help. Instead, I responded in a language her instincts understood. She submitted because she recognized competence, not because I broke her spirit. That's not weakness. That's adaptability. The trait that kept my species alive when bigger, stronger, more specialized predators went extinct. Chauvin's lips peeled back in a snarl that made Chimora's earlier display look like a friendly smile. You taught her nothing. You are meat pretending to be dangerous. I will withdraw her now and file complaint with... No. The word came from Chimora. The young Shirelle stood slowly, moving between Vaughn and her parent. Not challenging. Shirelle cubs didn't challenge their parents and survive, but protective. Her posture said clearly, "This one is mine to defend." Chauvin froze, confusion flickering across predatory features. Chimora, move. He's right. Chimora's voice shook, but held firm. I challenged him. He responded. I learned something. She glanced back at Vaughn, then faced her parent again. He understood what I needed. Boundaries. Someone who wasn't afraid. Someone who treated me like I was capable of learning instead of just being apex. Her tail curled uncertainly. I've been afraid of you my whole life, Mother. Afraid of disappointing you. Afraid of being weak. But he made me feel... She searched for words. Safe, strong. Like submission wasn't defeat. It was trust. The silence stretched like a drawn blade. Vaughn stepped forward, carefully positioning himself beside Chimora rather than behind her. She doesn't need you to fight her battles, Chauvin. She needs you to trust that she's smart enough to learn from them. I didn't break your daughter. I taught her something you couldn't. That strength isn't just about teeth and claws. It's about knowing when to bite and when to bond. He gestured around the classroom. These species, they'll be her shipmates, her allies, maybe her subordinates. Someday, she needs to lead them, not just hunt them. That's why she's here. That's what she's learning. Chauvin stared at her daughter, at the human standing beside her cub like a packmate, at the impossible dynamic that shouldn't exist, but clearly did. Something shifted in those predatory eyes, not softness, but recognition. The kind of acknowledgement that came when a hunter spotted another hunter's skill. You corrected her, Chauvin said finally, her voice different now, lower, thoughtful. The way I would have, the snout tap. Yes. Prey doesn't do that. Prey runs or dies or submits completely. Her ears flicked forward. But pack leaders do. Equals do. I'm not her equal, Vaughn said carefully. I'm her teacher. There's a difference. But I am someone who understands that respect works both ways, and that the strongest bonds are built on mutual understanding, not just force. Slowly, with the kind of grudging deliberation that suggested every instinct was screaming protest, Chauvin sat. Not submission, but acknowledgement, cessation of hostility. 1 semester, she said finally. Chimora remains for 1 semester. We reassess then. Her eyes locked on Vaughn. And you, human, you will ensure my offspring learns strength, not softness. She'll learn both, Vaughn replied. because the strongest predators are the ones who know the difference. Cheven's ears twitched, possibly amusement, possibly irritation. Hard to tell with Shirelle. Perhaps meat that learned to talk has some wisdom after all. She rose and moved toward the exit, pausing beside her daughter. For a moment, the fearsome hunter looked almost uncertain. Then she touched her snout briefly to Chimora's forehead, a rare gesture of affection among Shirelle, and left without another word. The next day's class found Chimora in her usual seat, but different. Still confident, still powerful, but listening now. Watching, learning. Wimbley had even moved one desk closer, though he still flinched when she moved too quickly. Progress was progress. Near the end of the session, she raised a clawed hand. "Instructor McAllister, how did humans become pack leaders to species stronger than them?" Vaughn's smirk returned, familiar and infuriating and somehow reassuring all at once. "We convinced them we were worth following," he said, "and occasionally we weren't afraid to tap them on the nose." The classroom erupted in laughter. Herbivores, omnivores, aquatics, and one predator cub who was learning that strength and humor weren't mutually exclusive. Outside the viewport, stars wheeled in their ancient dance, indifferent to the small miracle happening in classroom 3G, prey and predator, learning to be something better than their biology suggested. Learning to be people.